Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities, so do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
This episode is brought to you by Paramount Plus. Gladiator 2 is now streaming on Paramount Plus. Rated R. Years after the death of Maximus, Lucius is forced into the Colosseum after his home is conquered by tyrannical twin Roman emperors. With the future of the empire at stake, he must find strength and honor to return the glory of Rome to its people. Gladiator 2, now streaming on ParamountPlus.com.
The land between the Tyne and the Tweed was continually laid waste by the ravages of the Scots, and the inhabitants, neither secure in their homes nor safe in the fields, endured perpetual fear and misery. So writes Simeon of Durham in his Historia Regum. Welcome to Fortune's Wheel Podcast, a podcast that explores the infinitely fascinating and oft-overlooked high and late Middle Ages. I'm Jonathan, your host, and what you can expect to hear on this show is a story of our collective Western history, specifically on this episode, the sixth part of a larger tale of how three brothers dealt with the death of their legendary father. This isn't a polished story with neatly placed heroes and villains, but rather a complicated story of three young men cast haphazardly upon the peaks of European power. A massive vacuum was left when their father, William the Conqueror, passed away, and his three boys were left picking up the pieces. This miniseries that I'm calling A Tale of Three Brothers is a story of sibling rivalry, betrayal, power, ambition, broken alliances, massive political restructuring, and each man's quest for legitimacy and legacy on a channel-spanning scale that includes kingdoms, duchies, and even the Holy Land itself. This, again, is the sixth part of this miniseries, and we'll see England under fire once again, but this time it was from where everyone least expected it to happen. Before we begin, please consider joining us on Patreon, where you can enjoy more than 20 hours of bonus content as of this recording, for as low as just $1 a month. We have full series covering stories such as Poland's rise throughout the 11th century, and our current ongoing series covering the legendary Alexius Komnenos. Join our growing community and help this show bring our shared story to life. This is episode 151, entitled Rufus and the Northern Border. Thank you for your support, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show. After Henry escaped Mont Saint-Michel, the two brothers seemed to just shrug their shoulders and move on, because we find that they immediately shipped off, as Malmesbury wrote it, back across the Channel to England. This was the first time Robert Curthose stepped on English soil since before his father died, and he went on his pilgrimage more than 7 years earlier. But word reached Rufus that his kingdom was, quite out of nowhere, being invaded. Was Roger of Montgomery unable to hold back the Welsh any longer on his own? Well, not exactly. Wales was certainly a concern once again, and Earl Roger certainly sent word of his own to Rufus, but possibly more importantly, England was being invaded by King Malcolm III Canmore of Scotland. It took weeks, if not months sometimes, for news to travel the breadth of the kingdom and across the water. So Rufus was already a couple months behind in the invasion. For those looking for dates, it seems that about the time Rufus was unhorsed during the siege of Mont Saint-Michel in May 1091, the Scottish army marched into Northumbria. But it wasn't until July when Henry made his escape and word came about the invasion. Now, as Barlow states, Not a single contemporary or near contemporary writer offers a reason for Canmore to lead an invasion into England. One could make the case that he saw a weakened Normandy, a split Anglo-Norman empire, and England devoid of its king and some of its more ruthless and effective leaders. Strike while the iron's hot, right? But Barlow offers us another reason that I think might very well have some merit. Quote, Malcolm, through his marriage to Margaret, regarded himself as representing the Old English dynasty, end quote. It makes some sense, as Margaret was the granddaughter of Edmund Ironside and the great-granddaughter of Ethelred II. Barlow continues, quote, he and the Conqueror had made a treaty at Abernethy in 1072, renewed by Robert Curthose at Falkirk in 1080, under which Malcolm became William's vassal and gave hostages, end quote. The question is, though, does that vassalage transfer to the Conqueror's successor? Well, those details were never ironed out, apparently. What's more is when the Treaty of Rouen was signed earlier that year in 1091, not only did it solidify the succession of both the duchy and the kingdom, as well as disinheriting Henry Beauclerc, but it also stated as one of Rufus's demands that Edgar Atheling, who had been at Curthose's court in Rouen for quite some time now, was thereby banished from the duchy and the kingdom. Edgar Atheling, if you remember, was not only Margaret's brother, but he also represented the last remaining true heir to the throne of England, which could reunite the current England with its ancestral Anglo-Saxon roots. And should King Malcolm of Scotland be able to depose King William II and get that crown on Edgar Atheling's head, instead, then it would be England who would most likely be in Scotland's back pocket, which could have the potential to rewrite the last 1,000 years, let's be honest. And a small but significant question to ask here is, did Robert Curthose have anything to do with Malcolm's invasion? Now go with me here. Edgar Atheling was at Curthose's court for a few years by the year 1091. King Malcolm and Robert Curthose had already met before, back in 1080, as I said. In fact, there is evidence to suggest that Curthose had become godfather to Malcolm and Margaret's daughter, too. Her name was Edith, but she would change it when she became Queen of England one day. That's right. There is a strange connection going on, and the records have completely let us down in fleshing it all out. So, I wonder, did Robert Curthose send Edgar Atheling packing with a message for Malcolm? No one knows, and most likely, no one ever will. But it's an interesting thought to consider, I think. Now, as for the invasion itself, before King William even knew of it, Malcolm and the Scots had pushed across the Humber River, which was the unofficial delineation between the two kingdoms, an unspoken border, if you will. From there, the Scottish army pushed like a hot knife through butter across Northumbria and past Curthose's creation, Newcastle upon Tyne. Remember, though, Northumbria had lost so many people that there was still next to no resistance due to a shortage of manpower. But Northumbrians, being Northumbrian, made a decent defense all the same. Simeon of Durham tells it like this, quote, in the month of May, Malcolm, king of the Scots, invaded Northumbria with a large army, intending to push on further if he met with success, and to throw his force upon the inhabitants of England. But God was against him, and therefore his design was unsuccessful. When the king heard of it, he returned to England in the month of August with his brother Robert. Not long after, he set out for Scotland with a considerable fleet and an army of cavalry to subdue Malcolm. End quote. In a different chronicle of his, Simeon tells us the effect of the invading army on the residents of Durham. Everybody in the surrounding area, hearing of the Scots pushing beyond Newcastle, all retreated into the city, and the gates were sealed shut. On the north was Malcolm's army, and to the south was the local fyrd, and all involved were using whatever resources available to them. This, of course, was the foundation for a terrible situation and outcome for the people of Durham. Barlow writes, quote, the congestion in the heat of the summer, the presence of large numbers of women and children, and the shortage of food produced heart-rending sights and sounds. Horses were seen biting each other's tails, and many animals died." End quote. It seems William and Robert's joint cavalry and naval fleet was enough to scare Malcolm back north a ways, but still near enough to Durham to be a serious threat. Simeon says this of Rufus's next moves, quote, "When he reached Durham, he restored Bishop William to his see on the very day, 3 years after that, on which he had left it, namely on September 11th. But before the king entered Scotland, being a few days before the feast of St. Michael, that is September 29th, almost all of his fleet was wrecked, and many of his cavalry perished of cold and hunger." End quote. So things weren't going well for either army, it seems. The Scottish wisely retreated from the larger force, while the joint English-Norman force not only lost ships in a freak North Sea storm, but also the unseasonably cold weather that whipped inland from that storm, which had driven many to perish. What's more for Scotland, though, was what happened next. Simeon writes of the intervention of the city's patron saint, St. Cuthbert, or at least what the people of Durham interpreted as such. Basically, with the Scottish army to the north of the city and the English and the Norman forces to the south and east, Durham sat right between the two as the prize to be won. The people of Durham feared for their lives, as these things never go well for the people in their position, so they marched around the outside of their walls with torches one night, praying to St. Cuthbert. And when they awoke, the next morning, the Scottish were nowhere to be seen. Perspectives are funny. Now, Simeon wrote some years later, and piecing the records together, it probably went something like this, in actuality. While the people prayed to St. Cuthbert, even by marching with torches outside the walls maybe, the leaders of each side met. We know they met, actually, at some point. But it wasn't as simple as Simeon put it. Here's how he wraps the whole thing up, but after I read it, I want to offer some more details that bring the whole episode to life a bit more. So Simeon himself wrote the following, quote, "King Malcolm met him with an army in the province of Lothian. Earl Robert, when he saw this, summoned Edgar Atheling to him, whom the king had expelled from Normandy, and who was then living with the king of the Scots. By his aid, he procured a treaty between the kings of the island on this condition, that Malcolm should obey William as he had obeyed his father, and that William should restore to Malcolm the 12 villages which he had held in England under his father, and should give him 12 marks of gold each year. But the agreement thus made between them did not last long. Duke Robert also reconciled Edgar himself with King William." End quote. Treaty signed, Malcolm left, disaster averted, Northumbria saved, Durham still in one piece. Not bad for a Norman king in Northumbria, if I do say so myself. Now Barlow tells us that, quote, "Hardly had the blockade been raised when the exiled bishop's officials arrived to take over the city for their pardoned master." End quote. This seems to come out of nowhere, but a tiny piece to come out of the Treaty of Rouen between the two brothers present at Durham was that William of St. Calais, former Bishop of Durham, was officially pardoned and welcomed back to England by the king. It just turns out that the situation up in the north presented itself, and William of St. Calais accompanied them back to his old stomping grounds. Now, personally, I don't think there's anything devious happening here, just one of those coincidences in history. But as it were, William of St. Calais was back in Durham as part of the liberating army. Therefore, it just seems to make sense that with a full royal pardon, he would be reinstalled as its bishop once again. So, as stated, on September 11th, 1091, a charter was issued in Durham referring to William of St. Calais as the Bishop of Durham once again. Also present, curiously, on that charter was Malcolm's oldest son, Duncan, and Edgar Atheling, showing some cooperation between the two kingdoms while a war was being threatened by each king. Because it will come up later, it's worth mentioning that Duncan was King Malcolm's eldest son from his first marriage to Ingeborg, and Duncan was given to William the Conqueror as a hostage way back in 1072. Now, Duncan was popping back and forth from royal court to royal court for the last 2 decades. But one reason I think the peace was kept at this charter in Durham was the sheer number of powerful people in attendance. Archbishop Thomas of York, Bishop John of Bath, Bishop Remigius of Lincoln, Roger Montgomery, the Earl of Shrewsbury, Royal Chancellor Robert Blowett, William's influential Master of the Treasure, Ranulph, Earl Hugh de Branch of Chester, Sheriff Roger Bigod, William Peveril, Earl Robert of Northumbria, Seward Barn, the list goes on and on. To cause trouble in Durham on September 11, 1091 would have been a colossal mistake. But this was the situation that saw William of St. Calais reinstalled as Bishop of Durham. But as always, it wasn't as simple as all that. First of all, as a fleet of 50 ships from Wessex sailed up the Northumbrian coast, William Rufus and Robert Curthose pushed deeper into a territory called Lothian. These ships were heavy with grains and other resources the army needed to survive that far north. Once the ships reached the mouth of the Tyne, near Newcastle, with no baron there to keep order, the sailors ran like Vikings around the countryside, pillaging wherever they went. One chronicler even tells us that a sailor stole the very fabric an old woman was knitting with at the time. The people called upon St. Oswy at the same time the sailors decided to move on north to see what else they could get. As the ships reached Cocket Island, where the city of Amble is today, some 20 miles north of Newcastle, the story goes that in perfectly fine weather, those 50 ships ran aground, and then giant waves whipped up by something other than the wind swallowed them all. Well, the fact that there is a lighthouse there today says something about the submarine terrain, I suppose, but the story tells us that St. Oswy punished these sailors for their misdeeds. The people of Tynemouth heard about the tragedy within a couple days, and they flocked north to clean up the coastline, recouping what they'd lost. The problem for King William and Duke Robert was that these 50 ships with their heavy cargoes of food and resources, well, they were never unloaded. So the English-Norman army was without ample amounts of food with which to feed their hungry soldiers. And in Northumbria, well, sometimes winter comes early, and 1091 to 1092 was one of those years. Even in the south of England, records indicate the growing season was shortened that autumn. From the loss of the fleet to the reclamation of Durham, Rufus and Curthose pushed Malcolm further north. But they weren't simply going to abandon the campaign until they had an agreement settled with Malcolm, even if it took them to Scotland itself. But with the exception of maybe Durham, Northumbria was a pretty sparsely populated and inhospitable place, especially if you were from the south, and triple if you were Norman. As Rufus and Curthose punched further north, they were well aware that they were as unwelcome as one could be in those lands. Barlow writes, quote, "The Normans were almost as much enemies as the Scots and almost equally destructive." End quote. Lothian was a region in Scottish territory, and this is when Malcolm was forced to turn around and meet the southern forces. King William II sent his brother, Duke Robert of Normandy, to parley with King Malcolm III's representative. That representative? Edgar Atheling. Now, Robert and Edgar discussed terms, and to repeat Simeon of Durham's words, quote-unquote, Malcolm should obey William as he had obeyed his father, and that William should restore to Malcolm the 12 villages which he had been held in England under his father, and should give him 12 marks of gold each year. So, to be clear, one of the most venerated saints in England was a man named St. Augustine. But this was not the St. Augustine we're all aware of. That St. Augustine was St. Augustine of Hippo in North Africa. This St. Augustine was a man sent by Pope Gregory I, also known as Gregory the Great, way back in the 600s. And he was sent there to Christianize England more thoroughly. That St. Augustine was the one being unearthed and moved, or translated as they say, in 1091. That St. Augustine was the first Archbishop of Canterbury. Therefore, he's known as St. Augustine of Canterbury. A bit of a hero to the Old English at the time, and after the Norman conquest, Norman kings and barons wanted to associate themselves with the religious icons of England more closely for at least a few generations after the conqueror. So it was that we know that William Rufus missed this translation of St. Augustine of Canterbury in late autumn 1091, and the only place he would have been, instead of the ceremonies at Canterbury, would have been on campaign, which at the time put him in Scotland. As for the rest of the year, the two brothers traveled south from Lothian, through Northumbria and Mercia, and back into Wessex toward Winchester for the Christmas holidays. Curthose was eager to return to Normandy to take care of his situation in Maine, but, as Barlow puts it, quote unquote, neither brother would have thought of waging war over Christmas. However, the two brothers ended their brief cooperation on some pretty bad terms. We see Duke Robert leave for Normandy just days after Christmas, and he wouldn't return to England for another 10 years. As for William Rufus, part of the deal back in Normandy was, in return for Curthose's assistance with the Scottish up north, he would head back to Normandy to help his brother with Maine. But due to their newest argument, he wouldn't return to Normandy for another 2.5 years. Brotherhood's funny, whether you're blood-related or otherwise. Brothers can argue, trade punches, wage war against each other, and in this case, even pee on each other's heads. But it seems more times than not, the friendship is stronger afterward. But these Fitz-Conqueror boys, they're something else entirely.
This episode is brought to you by Paramount Plus. Gladiator 2 is now streaming on Paramount Plus. Rated R. Years after the death of Maximus, Lucius is forced into the Colosseum after his home is conquered by tyrannical twin Roman emperors. With the future of the empire at stake, he must find strength and honor to return the glory of Rome to its people. Gladiator 2, now streaming on ParamountPlus.com.
William Rufus bid his brother farewell, but he wasn't able to rest on his laurels quite yet. Though he had pushed the Scottish back north, the Welsh were starting to show some restlessness. Again. There were also a number of ecclesiastical appointments to deal with over the course of 1092 as well. But first, he had to secure his northern border. Off to the east, near the new town and castle of what would become, originally enough, Newcastle on Tyne, these things seemed pretty secure. However, the further west one went from Newcastle, the border seemed less and less secure. As Frank Barlow writes in his book, William Rufus, quote, the king cannot have been completely satisfied with the results of his northern expedition in 1091, for in May of the following year, he attacked with a large army the opposite flank. End quote. So by spring, as Barlow said, we see Rufus right back up north to deal with the northwestern frontiers. The area comprising what was once the kingdom of Cumbria was in his crosshairs. Its northern region had been more or less under de facto rulership of the Scottish kings since the beginning of the 11th century, while its southern lands were without question under the influence of, quote-unquote, the great Northumbrian family in which ran the names of Gospatric and Waltheof. That is Barlow's words. This had to change, because it was no secret that the current man in charge of that prominent family, Dolphin, had tossed his lot in with King Malcolm in the previous year's invasion. Forcing his way into Cumbria, King William made quick work of Dolphin, sending him packing to his Scottish allies. But ridding the region of its Scottish-leaning leader was only William's first move to secure his northern border. The king decided to use the established town of Carlisle, which is today just an hour-and-a-half train almost straight west of Newcastle, and a stone's throw to the south of Hadrian's Wall, a massive structure built back in the year 122 to keep the mighty Picts from raiding south against a Roman Empire trying its best to establish a presence on the island. Just as Newcastle was turning into a major population center along Hadrian's Wall out east, Rufus made moves for Carlisle to be the same out west. The king issued a writ expelling the current residents of Carlisle, and besides the fact that the king had issued this order, the people of Carlisle had no one like Dolphin to protect them. The records don't tell us where they went, but went they did. No longer Northumbrian, Carlisle was officially an English borough at this point, a southern English borough, at least in context, but Rufus didn't stop there. He not only filled the city with Normans and English, but he also invested in the city a bit to give it a little nudge in the right direction, a kingly direction, which included the building of a fully garrisoned castle. What's more, Rufus installed a sheriff to keep order there. Finally, to seal the whole deal, his reinstalled Bishop of Durham, William of St. Calais, was to be Carlisle's spiritual leader. The reorganization of Carlisle was to be, as Barlow puts it, quote-unquote, the beginning of one of William's most important achievements, his restoration of the historical frontier with Scotland. This new northwestern frontier was at last being pulled into the southern fold. One notable consequence of the Conqueror's conquest in England was that the northernmost reaches of the kingdom had no qualms about slipping out of the king's grasp. Though the stretch between 1069 and 1071 certainly devastated Northumbria, much of this devastation had a very distinct geological border. This border, this barrier, is a mountain range splitting England itself into two fairly equal halves, and is still called the Pennines today, or the Pennine Range. Carlisle is on the west side of the range, and establishing it deliberately as an English city, filled with distinctly southern English and even more southern Norman people, sent a clear signal to Malcolm III and other northerners in the kingdom that William Rufus meant business when it came to establishing a border between Scotland and England. This was the beginning of a centuries-long dispute, make no mistake about that. Rufus even placed a man named Ranulph le Machine as the region's new lord, the region being what would come to be called the Lake District. Ranulph le Machine was the son of Viscount Ranulph of Bayeux and a lady named Margaret. Why is this important? Well, it's more that these are seeds being planted that will come to bloom in the coming decades. But at this time, 1092, 1093, Ranulph le Machine was about 21 years old, and he was incredibly connected just by his birth alone. As mentioned, Ranulph Sr. was a prominent lord in Bayeux back in Normandy, so he no doubt was closely connected to Bishop Odo, the Conqueror's own half-brother. Beyond that, his mother Margaret was the sister of Hugh de Vranche, the current Earl of Chester. Chester was just to the south, so if he needed help from loyal barons, he could always call upon his uncle Hugh for support. Given such a status of birth, Ranulph Jr. would in the coming years marry one Lucy of Bolingbroke, which came with its own perks actually. Lucy was only 3 years older than Ranulph Jr., but she had been twice widowed by the time she married Ranulph le Machine at the young age of 24. What's more is that Lucy had already and would continue to amass large tracts of territory throughout Lincolnshire throughout her life, and her husband would benefit from it all. How did she come to such prominence and wealth? Well, it seems Lucy of Bolingbroke was most likely connected to the old Earls of Mercia. In fact, her family was deeply entrenched in northern regions, as she is sometimes known in the records as Lucy Thorold's daughter of Lincoln. A rather Scandinavian surname, isn't it? Ranulph le Machine and his wife Lucy of Bolingbroke were only the beginning of William Rufus's mission to secure his northern boundaries. Barlow and the records provide us with a laundry list of appointments and castles built up and down the eastern and western sides of the Pennines. Ranulph enfiefed his own brother William in Irthington. Ranulph also gave his brother-in-law, Robert of Trevere, lordship over Burgh-by-Sands. Rufus gave the land south of Ranulph Jr.'s Lake District, what would soon be called Westmoreland, to his father's steward, the old Ivo Taliabois, who also happened to be Lucy of Bolingbroke's first husband. Side note, he ended up dying within 2 years, that is the year 1094. With Hugh de Vranche, Earl of Chester, holding down the lands south of Westmoreland, Rufus felt for the time being comfortable. Comfortable enough with the western side of the Pennines. As for the eastern side, though more developed and structured, Northumbria was still in shambles from the conqueror's infamous harrying 2 decades earlier. Fields still lay fallow and untilled. Nature itself had begun to reclaim what was taken from it. Some records indicate the bones of the dead and unburied still visible after decades along the roads of Northumbria, a grim record in and of itself of its horrific past. Now, Rufus created the barony of Skipton in what would become West Riding of Yorkshire, giving it to Robert de Rumilly. Guy de Bailleul received Barnard Castle in Durham, along with Bywell in the Tyne Valley. John de Bailleul was given the honor of Mitford. Robert de Umfreville held a dangerous far northern barony of Redesdale. Now, Barlow writes, quote, "Although the effective frontier was still on the Tyne, Newcastle had been given closer support, and the Earl of Northumberland could with confidence operate beyond." End quote. Essentially, Newcastle couldn't do it alone, but it was a major center, and Rufus saw to it that he backfilled the frontier with able-bodied and ambitious young men who might just have the right amount of crazy to keep the Scots at bay. Just after this reorganization of the northern marches, records indicate that King William II was at a large, comfortable manor in Alveston, just north of Bristol. The manor house itself was built by one Harold Godwinson, and now served as the garrison along the Welsh borderlands. We don't know why he was there. We can only speculate that he was taking a first-hand look at his other frontier in order to make more educated calls as to how to secure it as well. While at King Harold II's old stomping grounds, the king fell ill. And it wasn't just a fever either. William was pretty dangerously sick. Now, in this state, he was still able to make the 25-mile trip to Gloucester, where there was a full castle and other necessary amenities to help him through it all. A castle and garrison for safety, an abbey for his spiritual needs, though he wasn't much for such things as we know, and arguably most importantly, medical care in the form of a monk called the infirmerer, or the closest thing they had to a doctor. It was the first days of March 1093. Barlow writes, quote, "No one says what his sickness was. Disorders of the stomach and bowels caused by poor hygiene, bad food, overeating, and drinking were common and could be fatal. Clearly, the court and the king himself believed at first that his life was in danger, and it was rumored that he was dead." End quote. But, much like Guiscard down in Bari a decade earlier, Rufus rebounded. The shock it sent through the kingdom was palpable, to say the least, and it got people talking about succession. King William II, he didn't have an heir. I mean, he didn't even have any illegitimate children that we know of, and we certainly know he wasn't even married yet. Besides the succession questions, William himself underwent what many call a grand transformation. Being near death's door, one typically begins to replay one's life, decisions made and decisions not made, etc. One thing that William did was question his handling of and attitudes toward the church. He truly believed that he was being punished for his past sins, and the realization that he'd been siphoning money from Canterbury for the last few years, since the death of his longtime mentor, Archbishop Lanfranc, well, that couldn't have set well with his conscience as he was laid out on a bed in Gloucester. By Sunday, March 6th, he had just the guy for the job in his presence. His new Archbishop of Canterbury was a well-known abbot back in Normandy, and this guy had already made quite the name for himself across Christendom as being one of the foremost intellectuals of the time, a man who had already written some of the most pivotal documents to come out of the entire Middle Ages. This man's name was Anselm, and he was abbot of Bec, and we'll learn all about him on the next episode, and I can't wait to tell you about it.
This episode is brought to you by Paramount Plus. Gladiator 2 is now streaming on Paramount Plus. Rated R. Years after the death of Maximus, Lucius is forced into the Colosseum after his home is conquered by tyrannical twin Roman emperors. With the future of the empire at stake, he must find strength and honor to return the glory of Rome to its people. Gladiator 2, now streaming on ParamountPlus.com.